Hey, everyone there. Hopefully you can hear me. So let me explain how terrible I am. I don't know if it was because I used Discord or not, but I tried. Sarah was an awesome guest. We had an awesome conversation. I screwed it up. I don't know if it was because I was using Discord. Everything was showing up good. It showed that I should be running smoothly, but I don't know. So next time I'm not going to use Discord. I used to use Google Hangouts and it worked fine. So I screwed it up. Probably my favorite guest I've had on, and I screwed it up. But what I did do, there's two backups to this. One, Sarah recorded the entire thing, and she's going to send that to me, and that will ultimately be the video that I put up. So you'll all be able to see that. Secondly, what I'm going to do for you all right now, unfortunately, I have things to do, like clean up dinner, talk to my wife, important things. So I have to do that. But what I'm going to do is play for you what I recorded, which is an hour and 15 minutes, which is the vast bulk. It missed like the first 7 minutes of my intro and then 5 minutes of me putzing around trying to figure out what was going on. But other than that, you'll get everything else. Now, I warn you, you're going to see some stupid things, such as it's going to look glitchy. The sound might screw up a little. And then you'll see me, in an attempt to solve that, switch to just an image instead of me and her side by side. But inevitably, after about 15, 20 minutes, I give up and I just do the recording, and everything should look smooth from there. It was an awesome conversation. I really recommend you watch the whole thing if you have time. So I'm going to be doing two things. One, eventually I'll have the entire video done well from her angle because she recorded it. She's going to email that to me. So it'll be available on Sarah's channel and on my channel. And so that will eventually be the video is up. But for now, what I'm going to do after I'm done rambling here in 2 or 3 minutes is I'm going to just play for you the live stream that just ended 5 minutes ago. I just got done talking to Sarah. So it's about an hour and 15 minutes. I think you're really going to like it. We talk about the free speech issues in the UK and in the United States. We talk about the problems with political Islam. We talk about Tommy Robinson. We talk about grooming gangs. We talk about the problems with political correctness, what makes America great. So there's a lot of great things going on. I'll play the video for you here live. Like I said, expect some glitches and stuff at the beginning, but if you can make it through 15 minutes, it'll be there. I won't be on camera, but I'll be watching on my phone so I could engage with you all in the chat when I'm not doing the dishes, because my wife's pretty insistent that I do the dishes. She probably hates it. You guys think she's some troll, everything I say about her. Courtney, do you hate me? She does, she says. I got her to switch from being a registered Democrat. Yeah. Trump time, Courtney? No, she says no. Oh, okay. So just a couple things I'll say before I start this. Again, I explained the glitchy issues at the beginning. Please check the link into my description for this video for how you could find Sarah's channel. It's just her name on YouTube. You can search it, but the link to the channel is right there. She also has a website, which if you go to our YouTube channel, you can find the link to our website. I think I had a great time. I think she's going to come back on. She's incredibly intelligent. And I think we think alike on a lot of these issues, which is a good conversation that you don't really hear. Now, a warning, I'm sure no one cares on here, but it was not a politically correct conversation. We're going to be talking about all the problems that you see with Islam, problems we have with social justice warriors that basically, it's heavy stuff, contributed to grooming gangs for 30 years, raping thousands of girls in the UK. Like, that's a heavy part of this discussion. So it's not a fun discussion in that sense, but it shows you the dangers that what we could see if we incorporate, you remember, who was it? Clyburn, who's like the fourth in charge of the Democrats in Congress. He came out and said, if we voted for the Bill of Rights today, the Democrats would vote against it. This is the stuff that leads from that. If you can't have free speech, and we already see that culturally we're self-censoring because we're afraid of cultural repercussions of free speech. But if you make it illegal to have free speech, this is the type of stuff that could happen. So it's very scary. The other thing, if you like this type of content, please let me know in the chat or in the comments afterward. And yeah, I'm not going to beg for money at the end, so I'll beg for money now. If you could, if you like this and you're on YouTube, please feel free to give a super chat. If you're on D Live, please feel free to give lemons. I'm going to drink some pink lemonade while I'm watching this. So yeah, without any further ado, I'm going to play the video. And it's a little, again, if you can make it through the first 15 minutes, all the glitches should be done. And then I'll later be putting the video up as well, if you would prefer to look at it that way. But I'll be leaving my computer here and just playing it. So enjoy. Please tell me in the chat if you could hear the audio before I get up and leave. So here we go.
Hey, I'm Sarah Corriher,
Oh, I'm
and I
sorry.
wanted.
I made
It's
that
okay.
mistake earlier, by the way. I was talking to my mom on the phone, whose name's Susan. It was like,
Not a big deal. All right. Anyway, I am Sarah Corriher. I have a channel under my own name, and yeah, I'm an immigrant who came to the United States from England. And one thing that I'm trying to accomplish with my channel, talking about predominantly American politics, is preventing America from becoming the kind of hellhole in many ways that England is when it comes to basic rights violations, which are so incredibly common at this point.
yeah, and that's really why I wanted to talk to you because I think that all of us could basically agree that the most commonplace country with the United States is the UK. And if we could see things that kind of go down a slightly more totalitarian road in the UK, that might be a good warning sign in the United States to like kind of back off from the steps that could lead us there.
Yeah, exactly. And I do see the parallels. In fact, when I first came here from England, right, I didn't want to get into American politics. I thought that, I was involved in politics in England, right? I was politically involved and hanging around with some political groups, trying to get things to change in a positive direction. And then I came here to somebody else's land, and that's the way I saw it, as a guest. I thought the last thing that I should do is get involved in somebody else's politics, that I don't have a right to do such a thing. And then as the years went by, and I think about 10 years went by, and then I started to see these parallels, these things that happened in England prior to things like speech becoming illegal, certain political speech being illegal, hate speech being illegal. That's a term they love to throw around. Antifa showed up, and that was something that already existed in England under various different labels, one of which was, I think it was Hope Not Hate. And they were a violent group. And I say a violent group because I was actually assaulted by some of these people when I was involved in politics over in England. So I started to see these parallels, and I was like, I don't want America to become England. I don't want it to become what I fled. And that's why I got involved.
Yeah, that's very well put. I'm gonna do something just so those of you. Apparently, our sound's working good, but the video's choppy. So I think what I'm gonna do is just if you give me a second here, we'll just do audio if that's okay with you. And I'll just put an image up that way. 1 second. There. So yeah, everyone let us know if I'm really sorry about this, Sarah. I have no idea what's going on. Yeah, as long as they could hear us, I think everything will work out fine. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about is I don't think a lot of people know that there is no First Amendment equivalent in the UK. There really isn't anything that guarantees your free speech. And that's starting to have real world repercussions. Now, did you see a change even in the past couple of years, how that's being more enforced, particularly with things like joking and things like that? Or is that something that even when you were there, you noticed that there were certain things you couldn't say that would get you in trouble?
Okay, the change has taken place in a very rapid period of time. When I was growing up over there, you heard people talk about how we're a free country, we have free speech, and people believed that. Sure, there was things that you couldn't say, like against the crown, that sort of stuff, because it's a monarchy after all. But by and large, you could say things politically that other people didn't like, and you didn't risk arrest. The year that I left was 2006, and I believe that was the year in which one of the first anti-speech laws went into effect, and it was the law that you would break was called inciting racial hatred. That was what they called it. If you incite hate against another race, which seems so very arbitrary, right? But that's what they came up with first. And then from there, they've just escalated to the point at which they're harassing people for non-crimes. And the British police have actually come out and said this, like there's several Twitter posts and everything by the police in England that said, even if it's a non-crime or you've been, offended by somebody, then you should, report it to the police and we'll go harass the person.
Yeah, and the way I liken it, and granted, I haven't been there, but the way I imagine it, have you seen people get banned from Twitter for saying basically nothing? Like, for example, saying there's only two genders. Or it seems like Twitter will arbitrarily enforce something where it's, oh, you said something that offended this group. Now imagine if Twitter had the authority of the police. Like, that's what we're seeing in the UK.
That's absolutely right. The two genders thing is an example of that. Criticizing immigration policy is something that will get you into serious trouble in England now. And, we used to, like, for example, if you're here in the US, you take these things for granted. But it's like, let's just say you got into an argument with a neighbor and you said something racial about the neighbor in the heat of the argument. All right. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Worst thing is the guy secretly recorded it and he's got a recording and he's going to spread it on the internet and people are going to think you're a horrible person. That's the worst thing. The worst thing that happens in England, the guy calls the police show up, they handcuff you, they put you in prison and actually lock you away. That is just so incredibly different. And I received a message from a English watcher of my show who basically relayed this very thing to me. Although he didn't say he said anything racial, but rather that he was arguing with this neighbor who was a renter and who was foreign. And they weren't arguing about anything to do with race. They were just arguing about the yard. But then this foreigner calls the police afterward and gets him arrested. And he said he spent 3 months unable to sleep, unable to eat, waiting for the resolution of this case because it haunted him. It could destroy his entire life. You know, there's jail time, there's losing your employment, everything, you know, and getting employment after you have a criminal record, you know, and this is all about a thought crime. That's the kind of horrendous environment that they're living in.
Right. And you can see how it will be used vindictively, right? Like you're saying in that example where it's a similar thing, which I say why red flag laws for the Second Amendment in the United States are such a bad idea, because when you encourage neighbors basically reporting on each other anytime they're upset and they can make this allegation with no proof, even the investigation itself is a scary thing. Like you said, your life feels like it's on hold. You feel like the possible penalty could be the ruining of your job. You know, you could be incarcerated, could be fined. And you're literally setting up a system where you're encouraging division by, you know, neighbors that normally might yell at each other and then lock the door, now saying, I know how I'll fix you. You know, I'll call the local authorities and make sure that they show up. That'll be a good way for me to end this dispute. And I think anytime that we're setting up that division between people within, I mean, that literally happens at the local level, but also at the national level, you're only asking for trouble.
Yeah, and you know, this whole thing about turning in your neighbors, that's like a phrase that we use to reference Nazi Germany. Right, that's a phrase people have used, you know, ratting on your neighbor, ratting on your friend. And people are being asked, again, to report non-crimes. You know, offensive speech, somebody said something mean to me, run to the teacher, except for the teacher is the police. It's kind of like, I don't know, making the public into juveniles.
Yeah.
You know, and I guess that's part of the way things go when you create this ultra nanny state. The state becomes the parent, and so everybody else has to be treated like children.
Yeah, and then it has the seconding effect. So the first thing you do is, like you said, you treat everyone like children. The second thing you do is you make it so you could criminalize any questioning of the authority itself. And we can see how dangerous that is. Now, the only example I could think of in the United States comes from comedy. There used to be this comedian called Lenny Bruce. He made a bunch of anti-Catholic jokes. I think 40s and 50s he was making this. The authorities used to wait outside his show and wait for him to tell this Catholic joke. By the way, jokes that today would you hear worse on television every day, but back then it was considered what was the word they used for it? It was hate speech, and so they would arrest him for bigotry and things like that. And there was a big movement on the left, particularly in this country, that said, no, you have to have free speech. You can't do that. The irony to me is both in the UK and the United States, it seems like those defending the censorship of speech more are on the left. And it used to be that they were considered kind of the champions of free speech.
Yeah, well, because they were the ones who were wanting to get rid of obscenity and profanity laws, which used to exist. And you know, we look at the First Amendment, right, when you see free speech, and most people nowadays just think free speech means all speech, but that's not what it meant when the Constitution was actually written. And this is really interesting. When you look at free speech kind of, well, so I should say constitutional originalist, Supreme Court justices like Justice Scalia, for example, would point and say, well, what did it mean at the time? Because it didn't mean defamation, right? You can't lie about somebody, put it in an article, and then get away with it, because that's not what we meant by free speech. It's not what was meant by the First Amendment. And similarly, at the time it was written, you also had profanity laws on the books. So they didn't mean that either. And it's really interesting that we have gone the way, and I think it's a good thing overall, that we've gone the way of allowing more speech in this country as opposed to less. I do think that's overall mostly a good thing. But it's interesting that England is going the very opposite way, and of course that politically things have switched.
Yeah, and I find that funny to look at different countries around the world and the direction they're going. Like, for example, we see in communist China, their schooling, for example, they're getting more geared towards not everyone's a winner. They believe in exceptionalism. Those that perform well are rewarded. They're going in that direction. Meanwhile, the United States is going in the exact opposite direction in that field, where it's, oh, everyone gets a trophy, and we dumb things down to the lowest person. And so it's interesting how you can see this kind of wave of back and forth. The United States, heading in the direction of free speech, the UK going the other direction. But I think you could see that could easily change. I believe it was Clyburn, who's, I think, 5th or 6th ranked in the Democratic Party at this point. He came out and said that if the Bill of Rights was voted on today, that the majority of Democrats would not vote for it. And one of the big things was they would say that we should outlaw hate speech. I mean, that's how dangerous this is.
Yeah, well, I've seen, interviews on college campuses where people have, gone and interviewed these college kids and said, well, should we change it to make it kind of more social justice? And said that without any degree of irony. And they've been like, well, yeah, we should definitely change it because it doesn't protect. And, you fill in the minority group, whatever it is. Right. But basically, the left wanted more free speech until they were in a position of power. When they had power, they're like, oh, no, you don't get free speech. We just wanted it for us. It's really like, you can see what they're really doing now. Well,
the irony is the so-called heart of free speech in the United States is Berkeley, right? During the Vietnam War, that's where they had all the court cases that said, there were papers being passed out, student papers that were supposedly communist or were anti-American, and they fought, look, free speech is so important, even unpopular speech should be allowed to be protected. And then I'm sure the famous incident with Milo Yiannopoulos going to Berkeley, where they decided to just pepper spray people, tear down the town, because they're trying to stop conservative speech. And it really does show exactly what you said. They were never ideal. They were never idealists. They were never, hey, we're purists for free speech. They were, what can we do to benefit ourselves? And as soon as free speech become a hindrance to the monopoly and power that the establishment left has, all of a sudden they're against it.
Yeah. Because actively seeking to overthrow the government has always actually been illegal. It's kind of interesting. But also, another example to kind of go with your point is the ACLU. They used to defend all speech. And they were kind of famous or even infamous, depending on your perspective, for taking this case of this Nazi group, and I don't mean Nazi like it's used now, I mean actually neo-Nazi group, that was talking about basically overthrowing the United States government. And he was like really flamboyantly doing this. And he got arrested and charged. And the ACLU took that all the way to the Supreme Court and won. Nowadays, they won't take any speech cases if the speech was offensive. So they wouldn't defend my speech or your speech if, we were in trouble with a city or what have you. They're no longer doing that, apparently.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, that's the irony of the ACLU. And I hesitate to say it's all about Trump. Certainly Trump's a big part of it. They hate Trump so much that, for example, the ACLU was going after Kavanaugh. I mean, that seems to be the bread and butter of the old ACLU. Innocent until proven guilty, the right to free speech, and things like that. But there has been a movement that you can see. And the ACLU, it's really simple to me. It's that they realize their donors are all left-wing. And so it's another example of, I believe that when that group started, I do believe they were purists. They believed in your civil liberties. They believed in protecting unpopular speech. But once they became an industry, once they relied on the money that was coming in, realized, hey, we like money. And all of a sudden they saw we can make huge amounts of money if we start going against Trump, if we start going for things like hate speech. And all of a sudden the ACLU looks just like another branch of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, it's really scary when the premier free speech organization in the country is now the champion of censoring speech that they don't like.
Right, exactly. And historically, they defended all kinds of different rights. And that's interesting how much they've changed because essentially, for all the different amendments of the Constitution, they would basically defend those people who had their rights taken away and gun rights, everything. And then they essentially stopped helping people if their firearms were taken away unjustly, right? They stopped dealing with Second Amendment cases, as they might put it. And then decades after that, they seemed to put an immense amount of work going after Christian groups. That was one of their huge things, going after cities that had put up a Christian monument of some sort, or trying to get crosses removed from graveyards and cemeteries. But it's kind of like sick stuff like that. And now they're like, okay, we've given up on all of our principles. We don't have any, you know. It's just like now they just seem to be like a leftist political action group.
Yep, absolutely agree. So just so you know, we were having problems with the live stream, so I'm just going to record this and I'll put it up tonight, if that's okay with you.
Works for me.
Okay, so let me...
In the future, we can do Zoom, or we can switch to Zoom if you like.
Yeah, I don't know if it's Zoom or Discord. I know. I had issues today with work. I wish I had more time, but
okay.
But we'll just do it. If you're kind of, but yeah, in the future, we'll just use Zoom or we'll use... Oh, for some reason it was working on Facebook, but that's all right. My wife just poked in to say hi. So we'll keep going. We'll just record it and put it up later. It's one of the things that I find the most troubling with all of this is at the exact same time that they're curbing back on free speech in the United States, and we see kind of what that could lead to in the UK, there's other things that are occurring, such as attacks on the Second Amendment. To me, in the UK, the biggest example of the problem with banning free speech will segue into our second topic is exactly what you said. You can't criticize immigration. Well, what happens when you either make it illegal to have free speech, or you just make it societally impossible to have free speech? And you see that a lot in the United States. For example, there are certain things, even though it's not illegal, if you get caught saying in public, it'll ruin your life. They'll do it.
Yes.
It's one of the things that you used to come up with analogies, at least I did. You'd try to come up with something that would be like, well, what would be the worst case scenario? What could happen? To me, the worst case scenario that would get laughed out was we could actually go so far with being afraid to have free speech that we could see mass rapes and people would be afraid to speak up. That's exactly what happened in the UK. And to me, It is one of the saddest stories of my lifetime that was able to happen.
Yeah, it was horrific. And what always bothered me was that it wasn't the regular people who were afraid to speak up. I mean, those people got together and had meetings. I went to some of those meetings in the early 2000s, and I spoke to some of the parents. You know, they were willing to speak up. They had been to the police, or they had been to the police 5 or 6 times saying, are you doing anything about this case? And the police were like, yeah, but we're working on it. Just, chill out and let us deal with it, and don't do your vigilante justice thing. And they kept telling people stuff like that, but they weren't working on it. And it took years later for it to be revealed that they weren't working on it because they just might offend the wrong group, or as they put it in one case, they might upset community relations. And the thing is, it did once. There was an event called the Oldham Riots, and Oldham is a city, or actually a town, in England. And there were riots between the largely Pakistani community and the native English white community, right? And these riots largely got started because of this very thing, because the whites started noticing that the Pakistanis were responsible for a lot of the rapes, but more specifically, rapes of children. And the Pakistanis in question would say, not to the police, but to the parents and other just regular citizens, would say, well, that white girl doesn't have any value. And they'd say that one way or another, that basically she's a white girl, she's trash. And I've seen news stories in the last couple of years that have begun to examine this, that, yeah, the Pakistani community over there, and some other groups, but largely Pakistani, are some of the most racist groups around,
right,
who think that, the white girl has no value as a human being and can be used and exploited and everything else in a way that they wouldn't do to a girl in their own communities.
Yeah,
and that's...
Right. That's something I talk about often in the United States. This idea of cultural Marxism that a lot of people on the left want to embrace, particularly the progressives. And the idea is, well, we'll separate you by these immutable characteristics like race, and then we'll say some of those races are oppressors and the others are oppressed. You see the same type of thing in the UK. And so what ends up happening is when you actually see blatant racism that actually has real world devastating effects, such as the raping of people based on their skin color, we're afraid to speak up because, well, wait a minute, that group's oppressed. They can't be racist. What they're saying, that group can't. The only, at best they'll say, well, it's wrong, but it's not racism. By the way, you saw the same things in Germany. I actually saw articles written in the Telegraph where they were telling women the one New Year's Eve that were groped, sexually assaulted New Year's Eve by a bunch of refugees that came through. And there were actually articles in the Telegraph from feminists saying these women need to shut their mouth. Don't they realize by coming out with their sexual abuse story, even though we should have compassion for them, they're doing more harm than good by painting a stereotype? I mean, that's really scary.
Yeah, it's horrendous, and I've seen it too. There's this person from still a Middle Eastern country, right? This person from this Middle Eastern or Islamic country. Well, it's their culture, and therefore they don't understand. And then you have these same sources treating these Islamic men as if they are above any reproach and somehow unable to take responsibility for their own actions. And there's something kind of, you might say, racist in and of itself in that very dynamic, right? And looking at these people and saying, well, they're not responsible. Why would they understand that what they're doing is wrong? It's like, well, if you want them to understand what they're doing is wrong, you have to prosecute them and teach them that what they're doing is wrong, and their community will be prosecuted for doing it. But instead, they're like, let's just look the other way because they don't get it. But it's something that is pretty endemic in their religion, and that's why it's going to take an extremely long period of time to do anything about, because they believe that this is okay religiously as part of doctrine.
That's right. And that's when I was researching this a lot and I was arguing with people on blogs, girl after girl that was groomed said they would literally read parts of the Quran and say, this is what gives us justification to do this. The two motivations was the racial component. They didn't do it to people that looked like them. They were specifically targeting white people. And then they were giving a religious justification to the victims, basically saying, you're my property. I could do what I want. Now, does this mean that everyone that follows Islam agrees with that? Of course not. But it's clearly a component to why these crimes are occurring. And when and if you're really, it's incredibly heinous if your number one concern is, well, I hope that people don't think bad of Islam after this. What about the girls that are being raped? Like, shouldn't that be the number one priority? But secondly, even if that is your number one concern, don't you see how silencing people and not allowing them to have legitimate criticisms and legitimately call this out, that smears the entire Islamic community then? And that's how you see... I know we'll talk about Tommy Robinson here in a while, but when you talk about the bad components of the EDL and things like that, well, you encourage people to go to people like that, because when no one will listen to you, when everyone tells you you have to be quiet, the only group that you could go to then is probably a group more extreme than you would have wanted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It creates the two extremes. But I will say, the people who were the most problematic when it came to these refugees, asylum seekers, wherever, from the Middle East, were the people who were the most religiously inclined. Like, it's very opposite of the Christian, right? Because with the Christian, you've got two types, right? You've got the person who says he's a Christian and doesn't really do anything Christian, and you've got the person who says he's Christian and really goes all in. And with the person who's really all in, well, he's a person that you'd like to know. He's a person that you're not going to expect any problems from. Whereas the other person, you may not know either way. But with the Islamic person, is kind of the opposite. And I've noticed this pattern. But the more that they actually follow, the more religiously they follow the religion, the worse it is. And that's because of what's in the book. I mean, I've read it. And I know what Muhammad did. I know that he was killed by his Jewish sex slave. And that's the reason for such rife anti-Semitism in Islamic communities, for example. And here's something that I probably should never say publicly, but it's true. And so I think I need to. And that is that when I grew up in England, in Sheffield, a place where these events have taken place, I always turned away from these people because, well, I was more racist than I grew up to be. I didn't like these people. I thought they were not particularly likable. And you could argue that my judgments were a little rash, and they were. I was young. You grow up and you change. But I think it saved me. I think that because of that stance that I had, I was a lot safer than the girls who believed what they've been told. Everybody's the same. All cultures are equal. All cultures are beautiful. It's those kids who believe that indoctrination that are most at risk. And that's horrendous. That these kids weren't told, actually, they believe things that are awful. Forget about their skin color because it doesn't really matter. But they believe things that put you at danger because they believe that you're a lesser human being. And it's awful that you have these generations of girls who trust these men, because it's not usually violent rapes in the side street. Usually, it's a grooming process where these significantly older men come up to these young girls, 10 years old, and act like they're, the center of their world or something. And it's later on that gang rapes start happening, right? And so it's awful. These young girls believe that there's safety from these people when they should be alert, alarmed, and thinking, okay, I shouldn't be hanging around with these people.
And it's common sense. Like, we all practice this with people in our family, whether it be our daughters, it could be any children, right? We tell children, stay away from strangers, things like that. Does that mean that everyone you meet might be someone who would do harm to a child? No, but we understand it's important to teach these lessons to children. We even there was a panic that I think was unjustified about the amount of how unsafe colleges were for women. Like, remember the stats that were totally fake? 1 in 5 women are raped on college campuses.
Exactly.
Well, those were all blown out of proportion and exaggerated. But no one on the left that's complaining about saying, how dare you tell girls to be wary of the Pakistani community? No one was saying, hey, wait a minute, it's not fair to judge fraternities like this. We shouldn't be telling, right? They were all gung-ho for that. So it's funny how, again, through their lens, we have to give up common sense and say, well, you can't trust your own eyes. You can't know that you live in these communities. And by the way, this isn't just us saying this. It is the official position now of most of these cities that their politicians, they've admitted 30 years that some of these grooming gangs went on. Thousands of girls raped in these grooming gangs. So if you're in that community and you've grown up there for 30 years, and you just know, you might not be able to say it out loud, but you have a feeling in you like this is dangerous.
Yeah. And the fact that you can't say it out loud is actually what creates racism. Like you were talking about earlier, about how you had the two extremes. And that's exactly what you had during the early 2000s when I was like early teenager, right? That's what you had. You had the groups of people who were kind of internalized how white people are bad. Believed it to such an extent they've been taught, colonization is the worst thing that's ever happened. Nothing good ever came of it, ever. White people are evil, have been the oppressors throughout the world, and therefore you have something to kind of answer for. You had that group who were more likely to become the victims, as I mentioned. But then on the other side, you had the only people who are willing to speak out, who might be, a little extreme. Mm-hmm. But they're extreme because they're living in this environment where they're told you can't talk. You can't say what's going on over there. You can't even talk about rapes that are happening. And if you want an environment that creates extremism, create an environment where people can't speak.
Yeah. And I'm actually shocked that it wasn't more violent by that group than it. In fact, the violence to me would have been justified at that point. Because here's, in all the researching I've done, like I try to put myself in what if I was there. So what if I had a daughter and I realize they're 13 years old and they're being groomed? So I go to my local police and my local police basically says, well, there's nothing we could do. So then I show up to the house where I know this grooming was occurring. They call the police and I get arrested. Then and oftentimes, this is not an exaggeration, the accounts say this. Most of the time, the police were treating the girls as if they were criminals. So they would arrest a 14-year-old girl from one of these grooming houses because they had drug paraphernalia on it. But they wouldn't arrest the 7 men that were pumping her full of drugs to rape her. And so at what point do you then say, it is clear that the establishment, it is clear that law enforcement is not just ignorant of this problem, but they are actively working to protect this problem. And at that point, I don't understand who we are to make a moral judgment that says, oh, but you should have been careful weeding out to make sure every single person that was in connection with your anger at this, didn't have any racial animus in their background. That is an absurd standard to give to someone who's trying to protect their children, their neighbors' children, etc.
Yeah, well, I can't talk about what needs to happen over there, but I'll say this, that it is shocking to me that nothing has been done. And I've spoken, to several people with this, and when you look at over there and you just kind of imagine being one of the parents and you're like, why is nothing happening? Yeah. I mean,
and we'll segue into Tommy Robinson here, but one of the things that I say all the time in the United States, and again, it's because it's so similar to the UK. When people will tell me, I spend a lot of time talking about corruption in the FBI, corruption in the military-industrial complex and things like that. And people will say, if this would happen, we will wake up. If they pass this anti-Second Amendment law in Virginia, people will wake up and, they'll take back their government. And I say, they probably won't. And you know how I know? Because the UK is very similar to us. And this is what I find As bad as the grooming and the gang rapes are, I almost find this part of it more troubling. We have public admissions from politicians and police and the leaders of the police in all of these communities, in Telford, in Rotterdam, all these places, where they admitted, yes, we knew these rapes occurred for 3 decades. Thousands of girls raped, many times gang raped. And not only did we do nothing, but we actively helped them. And yet not one of those people, to my knowledge, one politician, one police officer that engaged in that behavior has been held criminally accountable. Not one. Mm-hmm. There aren't riots in the street right now demanding that they be removed from their job. I mean, I find that mind-blowing. And if you can't get people fired up over girls as young as 10 years old of being gang raped with the consent of the police and politicians, what does the government have to do to fire people up? I don't see any hope of people getting fired up.
I agree, though I think the American people will be much more likely to fight.
I hope.
Yeah. Part of that is the fact that the British people are disarmed.
Yeah.
And whenever you disarm a people, you disarm them so that you can control them, right? Obviously. And that's happened in one totalitarian country after another throughout history. And the British people are well aware of the fact that they're not armed, right? They don't have an ability to take on police who do nowadays have arms. Through a lot of British history, they didn't have weapons, or they didn't have guns. Let me be clear there. And they didn't need them until mass immigration in the recent history took place, and you have kind of this whole new batch of criminals. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is the fact that they're not armed, but it is more than that. I remember hearing the kind of promises that you're talking about. I remember hearing about that back then, but I remember actually seeing the thing happen that they said that if that happened, then, X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Like, well, if he gets arrested for saying that, we're going to riot and we're going to overthrow and everything else. And then that person did, in fact, get arrested. Nothing happened because, people then start to worry about their families. They worry about if other people will join them or if it'll be a sole crusade and they'll just go down as, some terrorist. When people really start thinking about it, it just usually doesn't go that way.
Yeah, and I think that there's this, I don't know how to define this. I'm not good at putting this into words yet. I'm thinking of how to define it more. But there is this intoxication to kind of going along with the mainstream narrative, and kind of like we see it with oppression points in the United States. Like everyone's on Twitter looking to be more woke than the next person. I think that there's a lot of that in the UK that we see in this sense. You couldn't get people on the street to protest the actual police officers that basically encourage these rapes to continue. But Tommy Robinson showing up to a trial saying, look at these monsters, boy, they'd get in the street and they'll cheer for that. And I argued online with person after person from the UK. Oh, he's such a jerk. He's a racist. Good for him. He deserves to be in prison. I wish you had 1/10 of that anger and animosity towards the actual rapist or towards the actual authorities that allowed the rape to occur. And then they'll be like, oh, no, we do. Oh, really? Are you even posting? Are you doing videos online like you did about Tommy, about the police officers that got away with it? And you can tell that there's something. They're willing, they have this cloud over their eyes where they're intoxicated. Oh, everyone says Tommy's bad? Yeah, then Tommy's bad. But they won't speak up about these other groups.
It's like Tommy is not half as extreme as you would expect someone to be who is in that environment. You know what I'm saying? And it's like you hear people say, well, he's a bully or he's loud. It's like, yeah, he better be loud because he's the only person. He's got to scream for half of you.
Yep.
You've got all these different people, and I've seen it. Like some of the biggest videos on my channel about Tommy Robinson, and I got all these different Brits that came over, and most of the people who came supported, his plight. But then you got these, maybe 10% or so who were like, he should have just done what the law said. And they'll cite the law repeatedly. I'll say, well, he did break this law, and they'll cite it. It's like, who gives a crap if it's this law that is itself wrong, that is immoral? Is there no law that you wouldn't follow? Like, just how bad does the law have to be before you say, okay, I'm not following that one? When it's a law that says that basically you have to shut up, not report, get rid of freedom of the press, get rid of freedom of speech. At some point, are we going to say, okay, that law's wrong. I'm not going to follow it because there is something more important to me on this earth than what the bureaucrats say. But I guess that's part of the problem with the whole subject versus citizen mentality. Right. And there are a lot of people over there still waiting for the aristocracy to come in and fix it or something like that. And it's not happening. They're going to have to be the ones to fix it if someone's going to fix it.
And so I find I understand, and for those of you in the U.S., the reporting laws over there are laws that say that you can't report outside of trials and things like that. That's one of the things Tommy got in trouble for. But Tommy was very careful to be on public property. He was on the sidewalk. He didn't say they were guilty. He said they were alleged. It was after they had been found guilty. It was the sentencing phase, the first time he got in trouble. So I don't understand how his video could force a jury or a judge to imply a lesser or harsher sentence. But the thing that's, in addition, there's two problems with it. One, you're talking about protecting the system that failed little girls for 30 years. Right. So, it just so happens the person that was most critical of the police, most critical of the politicians that let these girls down, he's the one they're going to go after. And then you could see how the law is selectively applied. So I did a video on here last year, how trial after trial, you would have people from The Guardian, from the BBC, watching the perp walk as someone was walked into the court, like these famous cases, like, I think Gary Glitter, the Gary Glitter case, they had, they were filming him walking in, reporters were shouting things. Where was the charges against all of those reporters? And so it's clear that they're not only is the law horrendous, but they're selectively applying it. And basically, it's like we talked about with the first segment, you can't criticize the authority. That's ultimately what Tommy Robinson's guilty of.
Yeah, the state declared him an enemy, basically, and they're going to do whatever they can to get rid of him, including coming up with bogus charges. As you said, he wasn't on court property. It's not illegal to go outside the court and film. It's illegal to go inside the court and film, and he wasn't. He wasn't even, in there. So there's that. And then there's the fact that he was just reading from a newspaper.
Right.
He was reading from a newspaper that had the names of these different child rapists, as it were. And he was reading that off and live streaming it. And it's like the paper that he was reading it from, they didn't get into any trouble. No, it was right. Tommy Robinson, right? Just selectively, he's the one who's the problem, who's shining a light onto it. And you can see the judge up in the window.
Yep.
It was, part of this conspiracy.
And the whole thing is so evil. For those of you who don't know, it's very similar, except I would say more severe than like what you saw with the Roger Stone trial. How they tipped CNN to be there when the FBI tipped CNN off to be there when they brought Roger Stone out in his underwear while the FBI's all holding, semi-automatic weapons. And then the judge basically threw the book at him. And you could tell there was animus from the judge to Roger Stone. Imagine that, except go even a step further. Like Tommy Robinson, some of the things he's had dealt with, he's been arrested over a dozen times, most of the time for ridiculous charges that just amounted to him criticizing the police. He's been intentionally placed in cells where he was put with people of Islamic faith that he knew was going to attack him. He's had scalding hot water thrown at him. He receives death threats on a daily basis. Just the other day, he was arrested again because allegedly, which I don't know, I wasn't there, but an Islamic man groped his daughter and he punched the Islamic man back. The police in the video you can see, they didn't interview the Islamic man. They just arrested Tommy, and Tommy's daughter apparently told these police that he groped him, but they didn't bother to look. It's every step. You can even see it when Tommy's filming. The police on the ground, they hate him. The judges hate him. And this entire community of Islamic people hate him. And what's his crime? He spoke up because he showed that the politicians, these Islamic grooming gangs, and the police were all corrupt and were facilitating the rape of young girls. That's his crime. That's what he's done that's marked him.
Yeah, well, he was trying to hold those people, apparently, for police to get there, and they took 3 hours for the police to show up whilst he's holding these people who were accused of groping his daughter. And, again, they didn't interview his daughter as far as I could tell. They didn't arrest the people who were accused of the actual crime. No, none of that. And it just goes to show he's the enemy of the state, and that's how they see him. But, you mentioned that it's the police on the ground hate him. But imagine what it would be like to be a British cop at this point. Like, what sort of person would that even attract? Because it's not going to attract the person who wants to protect and serve, right? It's going to attract the person who's willing to go to someone's house and arrest somebody because something they tweeted.
Yeah.
So you're going to have that sort of a person, however you want to put that, the most authoritarian thug is who is going to be the police, and anybody else is going to want to get out of the business.
Right? I mean, I just imagine, I'm a police officer in Telford in 1990. And I know for about 12 years now that these grooming gangs have existed. And I go to my superior and I'm like, my God, I'm on the beat and I see what's happening. Like, why aren't we going in there and breaking this up? And you're told the official explanation of why they didn't say anything is we didn't want to be called racist, right? We didn't want to drum up hatred of the Pakistani community. I mean, how could you, if you're in that situation and you're a legitimate good cop, how could you sleep at night? I mean, it would be the most horrific thing you could imagine that you have to watch every day. You got there to protect and serve, and you're being told you have to do the opposite. You have to protect the criminal and facilitate these rapes. And so, yeah, with 30 years of that, who could be left that's reasonable? And so now you have jackboots that I remember doing a video. One of the police agencies, they released a photo of dangerous weapons that they had confiscated from the night before. And it was a series of small knives, including a butter knife, including a spork. There was a spork in the picture that they released. And I thought, oh, this is them just having a rib, like they're laughing, like. But no, then I followed their follow-up tweets, and they're like, "We don't appreciate this weapon could be used dangerously," and you just start to think, you're like, if you put 1/10 of the energy in stopping grooming gangs that you did from getting butter knives off the street, there wouldn't be a problem. And so, at some point, you have to say, this isn't an accident. It wasn't a whoopsie. And by the way, you might know more than me. I know of at least, I can't recall them offhand, but at least 5 towns that these grooming gangs. You had Telford, you had Rotherham, and I know there's a bunch of them. And
I don't know which ones have made the press. I remember towns. I remember Rotherham. I remember visiting Telford. I remember Hill, which I don't think has made the press. I remember Leeds, which I'm not sure if it's made the press. I know Sheffield. I know London did. Let's see, that's like 6, but I don't know which ones made the press versus which ones I just spoke to the parents. And this was when I was doing this. It was 2004, 2005, and Telford didn't get released until what was it, last year?
Yeah,
Rotherham, couple years before that. It's like they're not really in a hurry,
right? And when you hear, just a little aside here, when you hear in the United States, when they're talking about, well, the need to ban hate speech and the need to censor certain types of speech that could be offensive, this is the end game. This is what, this is, again, I can't stress this enough. This isn't me and you saying, oh, we think the police didn't speak up because they were afraid to be called racist. That's their explanation. That's what they have said. And so you start to see the power of controlling language. You start to see the power of saying, you're not allowed to say X. In the United States, we don't even have a law that says it. We just have cultural controls that says, oh, you can't say, you have to be culturally relative or cultural relativist.
Yeah, in which people learn to self-censor. And that, of course, goes on at a greater deal over in England, where if you don't self-censor, you've got arrest as opposed to just public condemnation, which is bad enough. Public condemnation and the loss of job and everything else can be pretty horrendous. And that already happens here in the United States due to big corporations having an immense amount of power, like more power than most governments have ever had. Right. You mentioned the knives in England. And if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to that for a second. Because there are 2 things. Firstly, there's a stabbing epidemic of sorts going on. That largely goes on because people know that no one's there with a gun. Right? The problematic people who have knives are these gangs where, you have like 7 or 8 people who travel together, usually young men, and they all have a knife, right? So if you've got one person standing there who's up against these people, the 7 are going to win. I mean, that's just the way that it is, right? That's logistics. Give the one guy a gun, things change, right? And it's been said that the gun is the great equalizer, and I think nothing really puts it into perspective quite like that. And also, it's not the gangs the police were taking the knives away from. You might think that it is, but actually the truth is everyone carries a knife. At least they did when I was there. Everyone, myself included. I was a teenager. I carried a small knife, and the reason was if somebody else comes to you with a knife, you show that you have equivalent force, and hopefully the person leaves and doesn't decide to attack. That's all it is. And so, everyone wants to carry a knife because they know that the attacker has a knife, right? And so if you don't have a knife, you're far more vulnerable. But the police, they're not dealing with the gangs because, by and large, the gangs aren't white, again, right? And so they don't want to mess with public relations. They don't want to appear as racist by having too many arrests of non-white people, and so on. So the people they're harassing are indigenous English people.
Right.
And they harass them and they essentially do what we would call stop and frisk, right? Over there, they essentially passed a terrorism act. I don't remember what year they passed it in, but under the Terrorism Act, they're basically gave themselves the authority to stop and search you whenever, if they just decide that you might be a terrorist. And so they're stopping random people who obviously aren't terrorists, and then they find out what they have, and oh, this guy's got a knife. Look, he was a violent person, clearly. He wasn't. He was just carrying a knife in case some really violent person showed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you can see this. It also, one of the things I like to do is, let's say you are that person that's really concerned about racism. Well, look at how these policies also have a terrible effect on people of color. For example, one of the communities that's really affected by these Pakistani communities are the British Sikh community. Now, the Sikhs have a great reputation. They're not engaged in any of this stuff.
They're great people.
But they suffer just as everyone else, because they're said, oh, we can't go after the people that are vandalizing your shops. We can't go after the gangs that are criminalizing you. No, because that would be racist of us to go after them. Meanwhile, if you're a dark-skinned Sikh, you're like, well, what sense does this make? In one way, you could say, well, you refuse to go after crimes that victimize people that look a certain way. And that's one of the, it's not just, we see this in the United States where it's, oh, you're only concerned about inner city crime because you want to go after black perpetrators. How about this? How about I'm concerned about inner city crime because I'm concerned about black victims, right? It's the same mentality over there. In the name of not looking racist, there are actually communities of color that are being decimated because the police refuse to do their job. It's not about targeting a certain race. But, this is kind of an aside, but it's something that I think of. There's all these shows on TV that me and my wife love watching, these criminal shows. What was the one called? It was like out of Quantico, Criminal Minds, right? I loved Criminal Minds. The entire idea of the show is they're criminal profilers. And so a crime will occur, and and this is an actual science, right? They don't know who it is, but they're able to look at the pattern of the crime and say, here's a picture of what this person might look like. Not just race, but, gender, age, what their job is, what their education level is. That stuff works. That's proven. Mm-hmm. But when they say, oh, we can't profile, it would be unfair to arrest people that look this way because then there would be more people that look like that arrested than others. That's going against what we know is the science to actually fight crime the most effectively.
Yeah. And like you said, when you're talking about the inner cities and the way that they're decimated, it's truly tragic because the police, their job, right, is to protect, you might say, the weak from the strong, or to protect the good from the bad, right? And if you don't, you create basically an area of mostly bad people,
right?
And because you've got good people being raised in an environment that's more like a war zone, and that isn't good for a moral person to try and develop it. It's to grow up in that kind of violent environment and then move out of that into the rest of the country, somewhere a little bit more sane. Seriously, it's doesn't make for a good transition into it. And yet we just ignore it because it would be somehow racist to police there like we would anywhere else in the country. Because, I live in a pretty small, suburban town. But if suddenly a bunch of people started shooting at each other, the police would do their job and they'd get rid of the people who were shooting for the benefit of those who weren't. And, race is completely, beside the point.
Right.
It's about who these people are. If they're doing this stuff, deal with them.
Yep, I
and
agree.
Bloomberg was right when he said you should target the high crime areas. That just literally makes sense.
Yep.
I know he got a lot of heat for that, and he said some of the stuff that wasn't right. But on that particular note, that targeting the areas where the crimes are taking place, well, that's actually just reasonable.
Right. And look, they have this in reverse. The social justice types have it in reverse, which is, oh, you want to target them because of the race of the offender. But it's the exact opposite. If you cared about, the plight of inner city black community, then you would want more policing there. Never forget, they always say, well, why is it that if you get caught with crack, that the law says that somehow you serve a lengthier sentence than cocaine? That was pushed by inner city black communities that were tired of the crack epidemic. That was black people saying, we want to take our communities back. They pushed for that law. And yet today we've rewritten history to say, oh, this was because crack was just in the black communities and white people wanted black people locked up. That's the opposite of the truth. It's literally the opposite. So I do think that oftentimes we overlook, and for example, again, I know I'm stretching, if in the UK specifically, if 10-year-old girls being gang raped isn't enough for you to say, yeah, we need to try to avoid that. But if you're social justicey enough that it only matters if they're the white or oppressed peoples, look at women that would come from these Pakistani communities. Do you think that women that are abused by these Pakistani men that are engaged in grooming gangs, whether it be physically, sexually, whatever, what's their course of action? They also can't call the police because the police are going to say, well, we can't arrest your husband because that would be deemed racism. And so they grow up generationally accepting this abuse, accepting this subjugation. And so after 4 or 5 generations of it, now it becomes commonplace. And that's another unseen tragedy that being afraid to look racist causes.
Right, that and female genital mutilation that happens in these communities. Police don't want to deal with that either. It does create multi-generational problems, like you said. Domestic violence happens at a rate that we don't even consider.
Yep.
We consider things to be domestic violence where it's really relatively minor compared to what happens in these communities and is considered okay in these communities. But police won't police it, in England at least, because they're afraid of upsetting the wrong person, appearing to be racist, appearing to be Islamophobic, and so on. And it's truly tragic because you get people trapped in there who believe that there is no way out. And in a very real sense, there is no way out for them. Because, where are they going to flee to? They're already in the UK. They're in a place where they fled from Sharia law, in essence. And you mentioned the Sikhs earlier. A lot of the Sikhs who live in Britain came there to escape Muslim oppression. Right? They came there because I knew a guy who was in his 50s or 60s at the time, but he was telling me about how most of his family were hacked up by machetes by Muslim marauders, as the phrase that he used at the time. And with people like that, I mean, and is he racist? Is he evil? Is he Islamophobic? Well, I'll bet you, yeah, he's afraid of Islam. He's afraid of these people. But, he's living in a community now where if you go to the police and complain about them because he's being targeted by them, in the modern age, what are the police going to do? Probably nothing.
Right. And, one of the things that I think is true that you hear a lot, we could criticize Islam and the politicization of Islam as much as we want, and it will have almost no effect. It will have to, like any religion, it will have to be reformers from inside that have the most effect. But when you see people even attempt to reform, like Majid Nawaz in the UK, right? When you see him speak up, he gets vitriol from this Islamic community. It seems like the most vocal, and I'm not saying these people, but you'll see them on Question Time and other places like that in the UK. People that are speaking up in defense of Islam. It seems and the fact that a bunch of people groomed these girls, thousands of girls for 3 decades, that's far in the back burner to them. They're more concerned with how dare you point that Islam has a connection to this. Now, I would think if it was me, and take I'm not in an organized religion. I would call myself Christian, but I'm not in an organized religion. But if there was a group that I belong to, that over and over, people in this group were committing heinous crimes, I would not at all blame people for saying there's something wrong with that group. In fact, I would be out there saying, yeah, I'm even more outraged because they're making me look bad. Right. Why don't we see that? It seems very telling to me.
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think the reason is because in the case of Islam, it's actually in their founding documents, right. Actually in their doctrine. Like if you had a Christian group, or at least a group that called themselves Christian, and they were doing something truly awful, similar to this, I think you would have widespread criticism of it from inside of the Christian community. And part of that is because we get our morality from our religion, and yes, we get our morality from our society, but our societies themselves are built upon a religious backbone. So what we consider to be moral generally comes from our religion. So I think that when you were to talk about if Christians, self-professed Christians did that, you'd have real Christians who said, no, that's not what our book says, and that's wrong because our book actually says this. You don't see that in Islam, and I think it's because, frankly, if you copy their main prophet, I mean, you look at what he did, and honestly, it was evil. But you talk about reformers, or at least people stepping away from Islam and talking about what's going on in those communities, right? Well, England is full of what most people would call moderate Muslims, right? Largely. But when you look at surveys of these supposedly moderate Muslims, you have something like 80% think that apostates should be killed. Yep. Those who have left the religion of Islam should be killed. And these are people who consider themselves to be moderate. So, it's like, I don't even know how to put that into words, but it's no wonder there aren't more people coming out or criticizing Islam publicly, because they don't want that kind of a fate. And you get into honor killings and everything else.
Right.
But when you're talking about someone who left Islam for atheism or for another religion, it's seen the same way, with a majority of English Muslims. We're not talking, Iran or something. English Muslims thinking that deserves a death sentence. I mean, that would be life-destroying to... Yeah, even if you weren't dead, you're talking about everybody around you wanting you dead.
Right. And you saw with polling, it also shows that the majority of these moderate Muslims want being homosexual to be illegal, not are against gay marriage, but actually the criminalization of the LGBT community. And someone that I follow over there that I like is Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray's a gay man, but he wrote a book called... what's it called? Like the strange demise of Europe or something like that. I wish I had the title, but he's great. And I saw a panel he was on once, and you had these kind of people hemming and hawing like, well, we speak up against all religions that does this. And Douglas goes, please spare me. He's like, as a gay man, you're right. It does upset me that some Christians were against me getting married. You're right. He's like, but how brave you are when you see a priest or where you see a preacher and you're like, I spoke up to them. But when you see the imam, you're silent. And he wants to throw me off a building. Where is your bravery then? All of a sudden, your bravery. Yes, I told that priest who was boss, how dare you be against gay marriage? But the same liberals that will speak up to that, all of a sudden, strangely silent when Islam wants to treat, and there's not even a question of this. Islam is so much worse for the LGBT community exponentially. It's hard. It's a joke to even compare the two. Yet, where are the people speaking up against that?
Yeah, you can definitely see that on the left, Christianity and Islam are treated completely differently, despite the fact that Islam is far more against the protected groups of the left. Right, when you talk about the gay lobby, I'm just going to call them, encompass them all. When you talk about women, Islam is far more oppressive, to use one of their words, to these groups than Christianity has ever been. And yet the left constantly preach against Christianity because, yes, Christians by and large didn't want gay marriage because marriage has never been about two men, and obviously, is a Christian institution. But they're literally throwing gays off of buildings in one Muslim country after another. Mm-hmm. No criticism there. No.
Yeah, it's really shocking. And again, I think one of the problems, I don't know if you ever saw the famous clip on Bill Maher show, which I despise Bill Maher, but he had Sam on there. What's his? Who I'm talking about?
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris on there, and what Sam's making the point, kind of like you just made, which is, there is a very small percentage of Muslims that will actually willfully engage in terrorism. That's bad, because a small percentage of a religion with over 2 billion people is still scary. But almost what's scarier is the next group. And that is, there is a percentage, somewhere up to 20% of Muslims that say they applaud those terrorists committing that action. Now you're talking borderline billion people that are okay with people like Charlie Hebdo shooting up a magazine because they made fun of Muhammad, things like that. And that's what becomes truly frightening. And for those of you that say, oh, no, it's not as bad as you're saying. Why is it that instinctively, no one will talk about it, but everybody knows, every major corporation, television network, media place, they ain't going to criticize Muhammad, are they? They're not going to show that picture that Charlie Hebdo showed. So you know that they know. Everybody knows. And it's a theme that I see with kind of this postmodernism, cultural Marxist, where we're supposed to ignore reality. You have to pretend, for example, that men and women are the same. And there's so many, and this is one of those things. We just have to pretend, oh, no, Islam's just like every other religion. There's good and bad people in every religion. Now, I have personally met Muslims that I would say are good people, but they are appalled by what they see, and they basically take the Quran as, it's not literal, I just take the parts I like and I follow them. So I'm not saying if your neighbor's a Muslim, go yell at them or scream at them, but clearly, like, you could see there is a difference. We could all see that there's a difference.
I completely agree. I mean, just look at Netflix, right? Massive corporation. They're like, we're going to put this movie out with a gay Jesus. Would they do a gay Muhammad? No.
Right.
There's not a chance, right?
Yeah. And
because everybody knows.
And to me, it was like the Charlie Hebdo thing was one of the I mean, that and the Danish cartoon, similar situation.
Yeah.
Even me, who's cynical, and I kind of see where this cultural Marxism leads and like kind of what's going on with it, I couldn't believe it. The people's reactions were basically, well, they shouldn't have provoked them. And to me, it's like, are you kidding me? The left has publicly provoked Christians over and over again. And I've defended them as a free speech advocate. I've defended their right to do it. Now, all of a sudden, where that provocation actually would have real power and real merit, because, again, I think that joking does have truth in it. And so where you can actually have some truth in that, now all of a sudden you're making excuses for innocent people murdered. It blew my mind.
Well, do you remember, been a few years ago now, and I don't remember the lady who did it or her name, but it was over in Texas. They had the Draw Muhammad contest, and essentially 2 Muslims showed up and tried to shoot up the place,
Pam Geller, I think, is who it was.
Yeah, exactly. And the number of people who said, well, she knew it was coming. Mm-hmm. Well, how many would say that at like a Richard Dawkins book reading event? Right. Because, I mean, you've got him going on and on about God and Christ and just how bad they are, and she's just doing a Draw the Muhammad contest. I mean, seriously, when you look at the two, you would think that there would be far more aggressors at the Richard Dawkins event versus the Draw a Picture of Someone event. But we know that this group of people is especially prone to violence, and yet no one's allowed to say it until one of those acts of violence takes place, and then everyone's like, well, of course it was. She provoked them. Right? Then it's obvious, because then they actually are violent people.
And this pains me so much to say, because on my channel, I'm constantly talking. I think the way we win this battle against corruption and stuff is through information, is through dialogue. I'm against political violence. So it pains me to say this, but it's working for them. Their violence works. They say, we don't want you criticizing our religion, or we'll kill you. And it works. People say, okay, we won't criticize your religion. Now, it might not work in the grand scheme of thing in that the people that follow that religion are being oppressed, but for the PR of that religion, go ahead. You have a network, go ahead and make fun of Islam. You won't do it. And then at the same time, you say, well, violence isn't the answer. You're caving into violence. That's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, we essentially have, like, I guess you could say self-instituted blasphemy laws, right? I mean, they're not laws per se, but no corporation and very few private individuals are willing to publicly say anything to criticize Islam, Mm-hmm. And you'll have plenty of different news time anchors who will criticize Christianity or basically anything else, right? Because they've got pretty free leeway to criticize in the United States. Mention Islam and they'll run. They'll just run from the whole topic, afraid of either being called Islamophobic at the minimum or actually getting violent threats or violent attacks. And, you look inside of Hollywood now and they've constantly got these anti-Christian stuff. You've got coming of age perversion, which is increasing, the number of those things coming out. That's all fine. But no, they won't mention anything negative about Muhammad or about Islam or even about Islam's followers most of the time. You see a terrorist attack and the first thing that shows up is #NotAllMuslims.
Right. And let me just say one thing I will say, else people will bring this up. You did see a slight in Christianity. You did see with the Catholic Church, with the molestation scandal in the Catholic Church. And there was a point where it was being covered up, but enough whistleblowers and stuff came out. Now look at how that was treated by the media. Pulitzer Prizes, what's I don't even know the awards anymore, but Oscars and Emmy nominations for the movie that came out, about this. Yep. And you see a priest now and no one will hesitate to be like, are you sure that person's not a molester? Right? Our culture has embraced. So there was something rotten. And imagine if it was the same with that, imagine if your community, you have a Catholic church and it was known that there was this molestation going on, but you couldn't say it and the police were protecting them and the newspaper would call you out and you would be shunned culturally. That's literally what we're seeing. So the people that say, oh yeah, but this happened in the Catholic Church as well. Yes, but look at what the end result will be. Hopefully it'll be the same with Islam.
Well, wherever you have a massive institution that's been going on for, hundreds of years, you're going to have rampant corruption. Yeah. And unfortunately, you had what was acts of evil that combined with that corruption to create this horrible turn of events. You had that. You have it apparently right now in the Jewish community, and some of their synagogues and rabbis. I saw a story about that at Yahoo News and how they're running over to Israel and hiding. And you have the kind of same dynamic where they're hiding some of their predators. You do have that happen. But you had the entire Christian community is outraged by this.
Right.
Regular Christian people, including regular Catholic people, find this incredibly abhorrent, despite how, the Catholic Church is obviously incredibly corrupt. Right? Because that happens. Hundreds of years,
Right.
You're going to get corruption, and unfortunately you have evil. But when you compare that to what happened over in England, again with those rapes, you had English newspapers who were slammed for reporting the rapes.
Yep.
Who, they were criticized for actually coming forth and shining a light on what should have been, it needed to be brought forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that they were doing the job of the police, they were doing a public service, and yet you had people actually criticizing, saying, no, you shouldn't bring that up because that's going to upset the wrong people.
I think, too, we'll just finish up with this. I don't know how long you can be here, but I think, too, that there's something deeper going on than just, I didn't want to be called a racist. I think that people on the surface level, an individual cop or politician may have thought that. But why is this encouraged in the first place, this sort of mentality? And I do, one of the things I believe there is a globalist agenda to kind of decimate who they see as the biggest impediment to them achieving like total globalist power. I think they want a feudalist society like you would see, in LA, where you have people living in their high castle in Hollywood and people defecating in the streets and living heroin needles everywhere in the rest of LA. And I think one of the ways they do that is through political correctness, through the censoring of speech, and through unfettered multiculturalism that's designed to be weaponized. I don't have a problem. Like, again, there are some, like you talked about the Sikh community leaving. There were even some Muslims. A lot of times when you see acts of terrorism in the United States by someone who's Islamic, most of the time it's second generation. And the reason you find out is their parents left because they left that indoctrination. They got tired of political Islam. So even though they may have still practiced it, it was a far later form. But then their kids rebel against them and they go with this kind of more severe, and end up being terrorists and things like that. So I think I'm not talking about those people that came and said, we want to assimilate. I'm talking about the forced accepting of these refugees. And they're strategically putting them in communities where they know it causes division, it causes decimation of these communities. And by decimating those communities, who do you end up crawling to for help at the end of the day? You say, we need the government. And, I don't know if you believe that or not. It maybe seem like a conspiracy, but I think that's what this is. And I think further proof of that is how you hear them saying, well, we need to do this because our birth rates are low. Who will take care of our old? We have to import younger people that'll work. Only problem is how many of these refugees are getting jobs in the healthcare field? Slim to none, right? Almost all of them are reliant on the government. So, I think that there is something nefarious going on behind it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there is a globalist effort to essentially destroy the West. And what comes with that is the Christian foundation on which the West was built.
Right. Agreed.
And so you see this in Hollywood, in academia, you see it in our political class, essentially sneer at Christianity, but also increasingly upon Christian values upon which we're built, right? Because even a person who lives in America, Canada, even if you're not a Christian, you probably hold certain truths to be self-evident, right? Based upon biblical narrative. You probably see mercy as a good, positive trait. It's not a positive trait everywhere around the world. It is in the Christian world, thanks to, Christianity spreading, for example. Right? And part of the West is a belief in limited government and in, I guess you could say democracy itself is somewhat based and, is a Western ideal. And all these things are being taken down so that a very few people can make their decisions. And they're trying to destroy our societies in multiple ways. There's the mass immigration of people who are easier to control, who aren't as educated, and bringing them here en masse in order to overwhelm our institutions, various types, overwhelm our welfare system, at the same time as trying to ramp up our welfare system to do things that it has never done before.
Exactly.
A combination that doesn't make sense. And then at the same time, telling Westerners not to have children, but we have to bring in these other people because you're not having children. And it combines together so that you're essentially replacing the population of the West with populations from elsewhere, from populations where the countries are not as developed. Populations who built, they built their societies, right? The people who live in a country built that country. So did their ancestors. So if you bring those people to somewhere else, they're going to essentially create what they created, the place that they were from. They're going to bring that. And so if you bring, for example, South American people en masse, not just as individuals, en masse to, say, the United States of America, the country will eventually look more like a South American country. That's the way it is, And yeah, you're talking about breaking down some of the most prosperous, wealthy, and I mean that in a good sense, countries of the world, so that we're much easier controlled. And you can find these strategies in communist documents. So exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think we can look and see that it's happening.
Right. And like, to me, the thing that stands out with the United States to me is the idea of the individual, of personal freedom, personal responsibility. Yep. And I think that's why you saw the growth in such a short period of the United States in its fledgling days. And this is anathema to all that, because they understood. You see similar things in the UK, though. I like watching, like, Question Time. I forget the name of the show. I think it's called The Big Question. I watch a lot of YouTube videos on it from over in the UK. I've seen a dozen episodes. What does it mean to be British? Right? Yep. And they'll be like, oh, it's like diversity. It's the same in the United States. What is the United States about? It's about diversity. What does that mean? If you don't have a cohesive message, then you don't have a nation. And when I tell people all the time, I could care less about your skin color. I don't care. What I care about is people that share the ideals of what makes this country great. Personal freedom, personal responsibility, and things like that. If you happen to be black and you feel that way, great. If you happen to be white, great. Any shade in between, I don't care. The problem's not that these people are a different race. The problem is they're coming from a different system. And people want to conflate when we talk about the problems with that, saying, oh, so you're racist. You don't like people of a different race. No, not at all. It has nothing to do with that. In fact, there's a good chance that there are people leaving a system like Venezuela. Cuba's a great example. There were Cubans leaving Cuba because they hated that system. They became great Americans. I didn't begrudge them because their ethnicity wasn't the same as mine. But the problem I have is if your mass amount of Cubans are coming and they're saying, we're going to fly the Cuban flag and your country's racist and we hate your country, that's the problem. And look, they could lie. It's another thing. It's a truth that we're just supposed to not say. They could lie and say, oh, no, that it's good to bring in these people. I mean, Donald Trump every day should be showing film of when that ICE detention center, when Antifa went, tore the American flag down and flew the Mexican flag. That should be on television every day for the Republicans, saying this is a metaphor for exactly what they want. They want the elimination, and that's why they tried to make words like nationalist sound racist. Nationalism, having pride in your country and wanting to look out for your country first, that's a great thing. Now, you could take it too far, obviously, but that's my feelings on it anyways.
Yeah, and you mentioned that they say that diversity is the best thing about a nation. And I gave this some thought a while back, and I thought, well, what's the very opposite of diversity? And after thinking about it for a while, I kind of came to the conclusion that the very opposite of diversity is unity.
Yep. That's the exact word I would use.
How do you have a nation that is disunited?
Yep.
You might say, how do you have a nation that's diverse? But disunited sounds more obvious, right? But, if you look at countries like England, it did used to be ethnically English, right? So if you were to say, what does it mean to be English? It would make sense to say, well, you're ethnically English. That made sense. Same way for France and for Germany. America was different in that you had people come from Europe, right, to create America, and they were bound by a system of ideals, of values, right? And that was what made America, well, great in many ways, right? But then you look now at the modern political rhetoric, and they just say, well, we're just a melting pot of everything from around the world. Well, you were a melting pot of settlers who had the same idea and wanted the same things, had the same values. Now you are bringing people in who don't even share the same language, but more importantly, don't even want to.
Exactly.
Aren't interested in fitting in and having the same values and having even a shared language because they don't care enough to associate with their fellow Americans. I mean, how's that going to work long term? How can a country that can't communicate with one another, the people in the country can't communicate, how would that possibly work out well in the long term? Imagine having a household in which people weren't able to understand each other and didn't care enough to even try. That's what you're talking about on the nationwide scale.
Right. And one of the things I said, look, I understand there is a surface level of diversity being good in that we want different ideas, but there has to be unity somewhere. You have to have a principle that you unite on, that there's cohesion about. And so for me, one of the things I said, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt a lot of time. When I saw things like the Covington and the Kavanaugh situation, this wasn't just random online people. This was the leaders of the Democratic Party that had millions upon millions of people agreeing with them saying, you are guilty until proven innocent. That's what a lot of the Me Too movement was about. And it's like, if you believe that, I don't understand how we could have a cohesive country. That is so anathema to everything that this country stands for. The idea of personal freedom, personal responsibility. The idea that the founding fathers correctly, based on English common law, by the way, that they would rather 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be jailed. Like that, those legal protections, they're literally turning them on their head. This is a dictate, this is kind of a fascist mentality that, well, if we say you're guilty, and then you have to prove you're innocent. And how can you continue a country like that? And then on top of that, just to get right to the point of it, now I don't care. I have a lot of friends on the left that'll watch this show and they might get upset with me saying this, but this is just true. You cannot sustain a government made of people that hate the country. You can't do it. And when you look, all right, back. Sorry, there's a little delay there. Yeah, I am just a regular poor dude, John. Commenting on YouTube. So, yeah, I thought that was awesome. I again apologize to Sarah and to everyone that I was having lagging issues. I think the problem is just that my computer can't handle streaming a call like on Discord and doing a live stream at the same time. So, I'm going to work on that. I'm getting donations. Some great people, Kenneth, Big Sky Crypto, a lot of others giving me money tonight, and I'm putting that all to new equipment. So I'm going to get a desktop, so at least when I'm here at home, I could make sure that it's powerful enough that I could talk to all sorts of people. So that'll be going on. So yeah, I thought that Sarah was fantastic. I don't know if she's still in the chat. Check out her channel. It is the first link on my description and D-Live. If you're watching on Facebook, on YouTube, she's got an awesome channel. I just subscribed this week. I just met her Monday. I thought that our conversation was great. I'd love to pick her brain about a ton of other subjects. So hopefully it's something we'll be doing on a regular basis, or at least several times in the future. But yeah, she's great, and you should really check out her channel. And I love the fact that, one, it's good to have someone that comes from a background like the UK, so she's actually seen this stuff. But second, it's great to also have that person be very intelligent and know exactly what they're talking about. And she doesn't pull any punches. It's how I try to live as well, where, I don't care if I say something people think that's going to be offensive. It's the truth, and she's right to say that. So I thought she was great. And I really recommend checking out her channel. So just a couple of quick things. If you like this, I'll just make one more plea for money, though. I had some great people donate tonight. By the way, I don't want to leave out Preacher, who's donated. As he mentioned, he's helped me with tons of stuff, including my background, a ton of other stuff. And if I didn't get your name tonight, please, I thank you all. I really do. But I am going to be using those donations. I'm saving them up. I'm going to be trying to get a desktop, which I might even pick some people's brains. I might do a video asking if people have recommendations for what type of desktop I should get to be able to run things like streaming while doing phone calls, editing software, and things like that. So you guys are always good for that, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, just a couple other things if you're watching on YouTube. Yes, it is true. My wife said that I do not have a voice for narrating forensic files. I don't even know. I'd need a script to go off. But someday I'll read one to you. I'll print up a script and then read one. So, yeah, I know people say to build one, and that's probably what I'll try to end up doing, John. People can help me. I got some friends in real life that'll help me. But still, I'll pick people's brains. A friend. Yeah, real life friends. I have multiple friends, Courtney. She's just in the other room on the couch criticizing me. I even saw someone posted it. It's like I got my own, what were the name? There they are. Ken posted 2242, from the Muppets, the old men on the balcony. That's my wife. So, what's that? Yeah, that's you. So, but yeah, thank you, everyone. I really am humbled to everyone, and thank you for sticking with me, those that did throughout these technical issues. I promise you, that's one area I really need to improve on. I'm basically perfect in everything else. Yeah, right. But no, I have a a blast doing this. I'm humbled of all of you that support me. It really means a lot. It really does. So thank you all. I really mean that. A quick programming note. So tomorrow I'm going to do something different that might be a total disaster. Normally I do live streams at noon on Fridays. Well, here's the problem. Because I work in home healthcare, every spring, I live 2 hours away from the office that I have to go to. I have to go to the office for trainings. So I always schedule mine every spring. That way I don't have to worry about snowy or icy roads. So it's that time again where about every Friday I'll be driving 2 hours or so, about an hour and a half actually, to the office. And that takes away my noon live stream time. However, I started doing these little, I think I'm going to call them, I've kind of kicked around the names. I think there's called Roadside Ramblings. Yeah. Courtney hates it. I'm a sucker for alliteration. I just love it. So I will be doing, from my phone, I will be the hour and a half drive out to my office. I'll be rambling. I don't know what about. I'm not going to set anything up. I won't be reading your chat because I am, as my wife always says, like the most old lady grandma driver you'll ever see. I'm really concerned about safety, so I'm not going to be looking at the phone at chats. If I stop at a light or something, I might check. But yeah, I'm just going to be rambling. The quality might suck. The internet might go out. I have no idea what will happen. I'll be on the interstate most of the trip. So if it's terrible, tune out. I'm sure there's a billion other people better than me to watch. But no, if it's something that you'd like to hear me just ramble whatever's on my mind, I'm sure it'll be politics related. But yeah, check that out. That'll be what's that? Interstate interludes. Did someone suggest that? Tippy, interstate. My wife liked that one better than Roadside Ramblers. Thank you, Sarah. Oh, I didn't realize you were still here. Thank you again, Sarah. Everyone that's in the YouTube channel, Sarah's in the chat right now. She was fantastic. If I wouldn't have screwed it up, we would have had way more viewers, Sarah. But that's all right. Next time, we'll get a lot. So thank you so much. You were fantastic. So yeah, just to finish up here, I will be doing that live stream tomorrow. It'll just be on my phone. Like I said, the quality might not be so good. I have no idea. I might run out of internet. You know how that works. I don't know what it's going to be like on the interstate, but could be interesting. And who knows, maybe I'll get pulled over for speeding or something and you all will get to see it live. But I won't. I'm hardly ever driving fast. So thank you so much to especially Sarah tonight. Awesome chat. I think we'll have a bunch more awesome chats in the future, both on my channel and on hers. Thank you to everyone who donated money. Thank you so much to all my mods that suffered through my technical glitches and placed my links up and helped me through all of that. I really appreciate it. Thank you to my wife, who not only made me dinner, but she asked me when I came out, and I quote, if I was a bit peckish, and got me a snack after my video. How great is that? So thank you to her. And yeah, everyone else that watched, I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. I'll be doing that live stream. Oh, by the way, I should tell you what time, right? Let's see. I got to drop you off work at 8, right? So it'll be 8:50, a little after 8 I'll be starting. And it'll probably go till about 9:45. So, and then I might do one after my training. So it would start maybe around noon. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it, everyone. Tune into that tomorrow if you want, and look forward to me being doing more stuff. Please check out Sarah's channel. It's the first link in my description. Please check it out. I think you'll really like it. All right, I'm off to watch Forensic Files. Thank you so much, and as always, everyone, have a good one.